They were told they were chosen, that God had called them, that even without swords, even without armor, even without training, they could win back the Holy Land. Because their innocence, their purity, their faith would be stronger than any army. They were just children, and most of them never made it past the sea. History remembers the Great Crusades, knights in shining armor, kings leading armies across deserts and into battle, popes declaring war in the name of heaven. But buried beneath those chronicles is a far darker tale. A tale not of glory, but of gullibility. Not of valor, but of tragedy. A tale so unbelievable, many historians once refused to accept it as real. This is the story of the so-called Children's Crusade. A march of thousands of young boys and girls, swept up in a religious hysteria they could barely understand, led by visions, lies, and false prophets. They believed they were going to reclaim Jerusalem, but what awaited them was not divine victory. It was betrayal, slavery, and death. In the year 1212, something strange began to stir across Europe. Whispers of visions, of miracles, of children receiving divine instruction. In France, a shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes appeared in the public square of Saint Denis, claiming to bear a letter from Jesus Christ himself. According to him, Christ had visited him in a vision, commanding him to gather an army of the pure, the young, the innocent, and lead them to the Holy Land. Thousands listened. They weren't knights. They weren't soldiers. They were boys and girls, some as young as 10. Some were orphans, others ran from their homes, leaving behind families, farms, and villages. They believed, with all their hearts, that the Mediterranean Sea would part for them, like the Red Sea had for Moses, and that they would walk across to the Holy Land without ever needing a ship. But the sea did not part. Still, they marched. Stephen was not the only one. Around the same time, in Germany, a boy named Nicholas gathered his own group of young followers, possibly unaware of Stephen's movement. The stories are remarkably similar: visions, miracles, the call to march, the dream of liberating Jerusalem not through war, but through innocence. Both groups marched south, through forests, over mountains, across dangerous terrain, through the blistering heat and freezing rain. Along the way, many died, some from hunger, some from disease. Others were attacked by bandits, or simply abandoned in strange towns. Entire groups vanished. Those who made it to the Mediterranean coast found not miracles, but merchants. This is where the story turns from tragedy to horror. In the French version of the Crusade, when the children finally reached the port of Marseille, two merchants, Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, promised to give them free passage to the Holy Land. They claimed they were doing God's work, helping the faithful reach their destination. The children rejoiced. Finally, they would fulfill their divine mission. They boarded 7 ships. Only 5 of them were ever seen again. 2 ships were wrecked in a storm off the coast of Sardinia. All aboard drowned. Hundreds of children lost to the sea. The remaining 5 ships? They didn't go to the Holy Land. They went to North Africa. The children had been sold into slavery. Some ended up in the slave markets of Tunisia and Alexandria. Others were scattered throughout the Islamic world, never to be heard from again. Reports from later travelers spoke of blonde-haired Christian slaves serving in the houses of North African nobles, boys who still carried crosses around their necks. Their innocence had not saved them. It had doomed them. The German group, led by Nicholas, fared no better. They marched over the Alps, many dying from cold. Of the thousands who began the journey, only a few hundred made it to the Italian coast. There, they were met not with kindness, but with confusion. The church gave them no ships. The Pope himself told them to go home and wait until they were older. Many tried. Some were taken in by local families. Others simply disappeared, faded into the streets of Genoa, Pisa, and Rome. No records, no graves, just ghosts. For centuries, scholars debated whether the Children's Crusade had really happened. Was it legend, a moral tale, or a twisted memory of multiple events combined into one? But over time, the evidence became harder to ignore. Letters from bishops, accounts from monastic chroniclers, mentions in royal documents, Pieces of the truth began to emerge. There was no one single children's crusade. It wasn't organized by the church. It wasn't officially sanctioned. It was a mass movement, spontaneous and chaotic, born from the desperation of the poor and the power of belief. Some of those involved weren't literal children, but teenagers or impoverished peasants who acted like children in the eyes of the elite. But make no mistake, many were children, and most of them died, were lost, or were sold. This was not a holy war. It was mass child exploitation cloaked in religious zeal. And worse, no one was ever punished. The merchants who sold the children? According to some sources, one of them later confessed on his deathbed. Another was said to have built a chapel as penance. But their names, Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, remain footnotes in the margins of history. The church? Silent. The monarchs? Uninvolved. The truth? Buried beneath centuries of sanitized history. And so we are left with a terrible question. How could thousands of children march across Europe, vanish into the sea, into the slave markets, into the shadows, and no one be held accountable? The answer lies in the darkest corners of our collective past. Because history is not just written by the victors. It's protected by those who have something to lose. And sometimes, the stories we don't tell are more damning than the ones we do. These child crusaders, naive, devout, hopeful, were not warriors. They were victims. Victims of manipulation, of blind faith, of systemic indifference. We romanticize the Crusades as grand clashes of civilization. But this story is a stain upon that myth. It exposes not just the cruelty of men, but the silence of institutions. It reveals what happens when belief is weaponized and innocence is used as a shield. There are no monuments to these children, no memorials, no feast days, only whispers in the dark. So remember their story, not because it fits the narrative, but because it doesn't. Because the truth isn't always glorious. Sometimes it's horrifying, and sometimes the most powerful army in history is the one we chose to forget.